welcome to Brown Girl Book Lover. I'm Leslie Ann Murray. I'm so pleased to have Lisa Ko talking about her book Memory Place. Welcome to Brown Girl Book Lover.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for having me, Leslie Ann.
I am so happy to meet you because I've just been I'm so happy we're doing this because, as you know, I've been stalking you for a while. And good stalking, literary stalking, nerdy stalking. And so it's just like a pleasure to be in conversation with you.
Absolutely, same.
Okay, why don't you tell us about Memory Place?
Yeah, so Memory Piece is
Sorry, I keep saying place, Memory
oh,
Piece.
sorry. Memory Piece, I think of it as a story of art, archives, and activism as different technologies of resistance. And it actually follows the stories of these three lifelong friends, a performance artist named Giselle Chin, a tech coder named Jackie Ong, and a housing activist named Ellen Eng over really their entire lifetimes from their childhoods in the 80s to Y2K around the turn of the century to an imagined future of the 2040s, and kind of shows like, you know, both how their friendship evolves, but also how their work evolves and uses New York City and their work as sort of a microcosm for the changes that may or may not take place during our lifetimes.
Yeah. I just really loved his book, and I just love the starting of your friendship and like that boredom that you had in the 80s and 90s that I don't know if kids now have. I just love how you documented it, and with that boredom create community was created and like art was created. Memory Priest is queer not only in content but in form. Its playful approach to craft, not quite experimental, but subtly imaginative and non-conforming. And I thought that was just like the perfect description of this book. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. I don't think I set out to necessarily have the book structured in the way that it ultimately was. I feel like I'm a very kind of setting out to write a project without necessarily knowing how it's going to end up. And it takes me a while to write my books. You know, it took me about 7 years to write my first novel, The Leavers. It took me 5 to 6 years to write Memory Piece. And I think as I was writing, it became clear what the story was about, you know, and that took several years as well, to realize it was really about kind of telling a story of like how we got to where we might be going. And the third character, Ellen, sort of made herself more known in the process of writing the story. She was, you know, at first the sort of intrusive friend to both Jackie and Giselle. And I realized over time that the story in the novel kind of belonged to her in a way. And I think with the sort of just experimenting and like writing and deleting and revising over time, the structure of the book became more clear to me, and that I really wanted to sort of use these, you know, ways of working with both nostalgia and dystopia to talk about the present, right? And so the structure of like the three women's stories moving from the past to the future kind of, you know, honed itself, I think, over time and over experimentation, and it became kind of fun to play with that. And I wanted the experience of reading the book to sort of mimic the experience of like moving through time, right? So we're kind of going from this mundane, kind of boring, you know, familiar suburban childhood, and kind of using these cultural touchstones of nostalgia, you know, 80s malls, Orange Julius, like tapes, you know, zines, and then kind of dropping us into this potential future in which the status quo simply continues, right? And that kind of disorienting, unmooring feeling of both experiencing it and also reading it.
I love that. You know, when I was reading this book, I just was like, okay, this is like amazing craft, right? And I feel like I really want to like talk about craft a little bit because first of all, I feel like a lot of writers of color are not celebrated enough, especially women, about their craft, right? In terms of writing. And I was amazed how you were able to collapse so much time in a short book. It's a short
Yeah,
read.
it's your book. Yeah.
A thousand pages more, right? And how were you able to do that so succinctly and keep us wanting more?
Thank you. Honestly, I think it's through writing a lot and deleting even more. I think there's a lot of different kinds of writers. Like some people sort of, I don't know, have trouble generating words, but when they do, like every word is perfect. I'm not that writer. I think I probably end up writing like the equivalent of two novels to every novel that I write, right? Meaning in terms of like the actual word count that I produce. And so the book is like, as you mentioned, like not super long. It's like, I think 85,000 words. And I kind of took care to have each of the three sections be exactly the same word count. And and that was just through a lot of deleting. So I wrote many scenes that ended up informing the book and the story and my understanding of the characters, but absolutely did not make it into that final version. So there were scenes about, the different friends at different points in their life, different locations, like different possibilities for their friendship and their own like lives that ended up getting cut. So I think that's the secret, right? Sort of like writing to inform the story and then like just obsessively revising and cleaning it up. So what you ultimately see is like a much, hopefully, tighter and more minimal form.
Can you talk about that? Like, why was it important to like not use this like linear structure?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I think really when I realized that the larger story was about kind of how these worlds of the art world and like the tech industry and housing and gentrification have worked together over time to produce like not only the present we live in, but this potential near future. It felt important to tell the story like through those lenses as well, right? And through those lenses of the three characters and the three women. I think it was also just a question of like wanting to create that tone and that suspense for the reader. And instead of sort of concentrating the book in like one smaller period of time or sort of interweaving the characters' lives more tightly together. I wanted them to have like I wanted the friends to be these kinds of relationships that maybe that I know that I relate to, maybe others do as well, where you have these friends that you maybe share these like early experiences with in childhood, and you don't necessarily see each other all the time or talk to each other all the time, but you very kind of unconsciously even end up influencing one another's lives in these huge ways, right? And I think that these three characters end up doing that, Jackie, Giselle, and Ellen, and they're really sort of all parts of the same whole too, right? And I'm hoping that the book structure kind of mirrors that, right? These tensions between, like freedom and success and safety and security and like, living your values, right? And you see all these characters kind of wrestling with all those questions throughout. And I think the fun of having that structure is that you get to sort of see you get to play that off of one another. You get to see like how one character sees the other, and then move to another section where you see the opposite happen, right? So I think Jackie and Giselle are often seeing like Ellen as somebody who's like this, I don't know, morally upright, judgmental person. They're often making these decisions being like, oh my God, Ellen would really disapprove or Ellen would be mad at me. And then you go to Ellen's section, you see that she's just like a regular person like everyone else. Like she has her own insecurities. She has her own sort of like, questioning herself as well. Right. And then it's sort of like a fun way to sort of create a larger, more three-dimensional and complex look at the group as a whole. Right?
I want to go back to something you just said, and I because I'm just so interested in like how you saw that link between gentrification, art, and technology, because it
Mm.
feels so separate before I read this book. And wait a minute. And like, how did you see that before all of us?
Mm. Partly I think it's like as a novelist, we're following our own obsessions, like so even if we are fiction writers and we're writing about people that aren't us and it's not necessarily a autobiographical story in any way, we're like following these breadcrumbs of whatever we're obsessed with, right? So I kind of always knew I wanted to write about these, creative practitioners and artists in some ways, and was also kind of interested in writing about this moment at the turn of the century of like unbridled tech optimism. And, just because those were periods of times I lived through as a young person and remember sort of creating in that way, right? So that was sort of also a kind of period of artistic creativity. You see that with like Jackie as a tech coder, imagining this better world through technology. And I think anytime we're writing about the past, like it's inevitable that we start thinking about like what's changed since then. And as I was writing it, I was like, oh wow, this is so interesting because it's almost like a little ominous, or maybe not even a little ominous, like big ominous when we think about what's happened with tech since then in the past 25 years. Like we've moved from this moment of like, let's share everything about our lives online and no one's going to read it but our friends, to being like, oh yeah, the government's like scanning our retinas, and like tracking our movements, right? And we have to like purchase tools to sort of limit our digital footprint, right? And so you start thinking kind of like what's changed. And I think it became clear that the larger question was also like what's changed with our lives. And as like a longtime resident of New York City, you can see kind of how gentrification has, and like real estate development has also limited the choices and the abilities of people to like stay in the city and to like create art and to like have the time to like choose what projects to pursue, right? So that seemed to be like a very clear thread with all three of the characters. You're always all trying to figure out like that work-life balance, that like equation of like having to find or buy time to pursue their passion projects. And it just became clear that like those three industries were really working and influencing one another as well, to create 2025 and maybe 2041.
I just I love how writers think, and I love how like these three separate ideas that I feel like was one separate are like so connected, and how you were able to like thread it. Like what are your now new obsessions or
There's so many new obsessions. It never ends up. Yeah, I think whatever I'm like writing feels like it's either overtly or even like unconsciously responding to like the world around me, right? And that's something that I really kind of learned over the years of writing this book, like that novel writing in some ways is like its own kind of like durational performance piece. Like we're taking different things that are happening in our lives and responding to them. Like, I'm working on a project where the characters are, in their 40s and responding to like some of the things happening in the world, even though it's not explicitly about that. I think it's like informed by that feeling, right? So yeah, I always find that just sort of fascinating, what we end up kind of taking from and like how it ends up playing out in the work itself.
okay, so there's also in the book there's this tenderness, right? The loyalty of friendship, the complicated pull of memory, the hope of making something that lasts. Like how did you balance like despair and hope in your storytelling?
Yeah, that's a great question. I feel like fear and hope are really woven throughout the book. I kind of wrote into my own anxieties about the future and the present. I think anytime we're writing about the future, it's really about the present. And I was sort of giving some of those anxieties to my characters, and again, this is maybe how writing a novel is a performance durational art piece, but like hoping that through the act of writing, I would kind of figure out how to return to my own hope, if that makes sense, right? And so I put a lot of my own anxieties around the future, around, this world of like increased militarization and surveillance that some of the characters are living through in the future, and then allowed them to survive and connect and create in spite of that, right? And so I think that's what you're seeing in those final chapters, where the characters are living through difficult times, as we all are, and have been, but they are still finding these moments of joy. There's still parties, and there's meetings, and there's dinners together, and they're like working together to both like survive and resist and create. Like, they're still creating art and connection, right? And that felt really meaningful to me as a writer, to be able to like visualize those scenes. I think that, imagination plays such a important part in this too. It's like, if we can't imagine a future where we're surviving and creating and connecting, then we can't possibly live it, right? Like, we have to kind of be able to visualize the world that we want to live in. And so in some ways it was a practice of writing this, like, imagined future that was hopeful and also potentially realistic, right? It felt important to both kind of balance that like acknowledgement of the past and the present, but be able to visualize something, some beautiful nonetheless.
Yeah. And I think it's really important that we have to have hope, right? We have to believe. I once said that, like, like if you don't have hope, you're like capitulated into white supremacy, like
Mhm.
that nothing is going to change, right? It's just going to be static. And I think that's really important, of like, you these holding up these two truths, right? Like, it is destructive, it is sad what's currently happening, but we have to have hope, we have to have joy, and we can use that to resist and build and create like community, right? Otherwise
Yeah,
it's so hard to function.
yeah. Yeah, I feel like there's always, it's like a pull towards like this ahistorical present, right? Where like the dominant narrative is like, everything's always been great. Like, all these things never happen. Like, we're not living in a country founded on all this violence, right? And so that's like one way that like we're being pushed to go. And then there's also this like place of, you know, powerlessness and numbness that's also very seductive, right? So it takes a lot of like energy, but it's so important to sort of like, both like acknowledge the real history, and also like, as you mentioned, like be able to like have hope for the future, and to sort of situate ourselves in this like legacy, right, in which the characters are kind of doing, right? They're part of something that is like ongoing, like we all are. They're grounding themselves in both the past and seeing themselves as, like future ancestors in a way, right? So there's a lot of beauty to like having faith that we're going to survive and keep going, and that there will be a future.
I want to talk about like just archives and memory, because I just like, I'm really now big into archiving, and I'm like, no, we got to archive it for whoever, right? And like, so I save like pieces of things or communication with my friends, but I think a big thing why I do this is to like create an archive of like amazing writers of color that we exist, we've always been here, and we'll continue to build in. It's like a knowledge bank, and so much of this like book is also about like archives and memory, and
Mhm.
like, and I just want you to talk about like how that works in the book, but also talk about like just the power of archives in general.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I feel like I've always been a very natural archivist, right? There's, I think, even from a very young age, been this fear of like forgetting and fear of like losing that history. And in some ways, like, I feel like I've always been wrestling with like how to balance that, right? Like, there's a way that I think you can I don't know, at least in my case, like over archive and like save too much. And, then you have like too much physical material and also it's kind of like mentally weighing you down. Right. And at the same time, it's important to not like completely forget. And then, like, as you mentioned too, like it's so powerful to be able to keep a record. Right. And it's so necessary. And, like memory is again, like a really big part of the book. I think all three of the characters are like continually working with memory in different ways. Giselle does these performances where she's like recording all her memories in notebooks for hours at a time. She's very into like time capsules and like, saving memory and like creating that as like not only her art, but like her way of kind of seeing and moving through the world. And Jackie is creating, technology that helps people kind of store their memories as well. And Ellen is kind of, in this place in the future where memory has become a liability that, it's you can be sort of punished for remembering, and you also maybe selectively forget things too that are painful. And she kind of has to learn the lesson of regaining her memories in order to keep going. So I feel like that's something that feels like perpetually timely, I think, right? It's, we're definitely living in a moment of an escalating erasure of history and memory, and that being used to justify actual violence against people in real time. And because of that, it's so important, I think, to keep, grounded in this form of like collective memory, right? And like the work that you're doing to like record and archive, and the work that we're all doing in our own ways, how powerful that is when that kind of comes together, right? We all kind of do our own part and create this like collective memory and collective archive at a time where, it can be dangerous to remember, or we're being kind of forced to forget, right? How beautiful is it to remember in spite of that?
Yeah. So I ask every writer this about like creating dangerously, right? This is based on Edwidge Danticat's now essay collection, Creating Dangerously, the immigrant writer at work, in like the importance of writers to create dangerously. And so my question to you is, how are you creating dangerously?
Wow, what a great question. Um, I mean, I think a lot about the importance of storytelling and narrative, especially at this time when I feel like we're experiencing kind of a like a battle of competing narratives and storytelling for the truth, right? Like and it feels so important to be like grounded in the truth and grounded in reality. And I think that's a skill that we as storytellers and writers have that we might not even realize. I also just think about it in the way that like, you know, to keep writing and reading and putting our attention and our limited free time and energy on like books and fiction and novels, like we're going against so many expectations in a way, right? Like it's especially in this very like technologically accelerated time where we're seeing, the rise of AI and the like constriction of like attention spans, right? Like choosing to pursue this form of art, of creating, of even like living, feels like it's kind of going in the face of what like the dominant culture expects, right? So there's something to me that's like, I don't know, that feels like important in like choosing that, right? To be like, oh yeah, I'm gonna choose to like write in this like format that, maybe isn't necessarily, I don't know, something that's like mm, spotlighted in the same way, right? Or like being given attention in a way. And I think that there's a reason why, books are being banned and that authors are being censored and that they don't want us to be exercising and like honing our ability to like read longer narratives and create longer narratives and like have like the ability to like think critically, right? So yeah, so insisting on doing that still feels really important.
I really love these characters. And like, they're so well formed and they're so well developed, they're so embodied. I actually thought like, they were based on real people having these multi-dimensional, multi-feeling characters and families. It was so compelling and moving to see.
Oh,
And
thank you.
really, really, really important for us to see. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your questions and for reading the book.